Well, thank you, Stephen Sillett, for joining us today on behalf of the World Creativity and Innovation Week and Day, the United Nations International Day of Observance. I would like to really welcome you and thank you for joining us today to really explore a lot of what I think and a lot of people in our community believe are groundbreaking techniques and approaches that you have been working on and expanding for some years now. And as an innovator and someone that works with creatives and innovation, often we are challenged by some of these issues and questions that you're working with very intimately around spatial configurations, around how we broker and intermediate our relationships to places, and certainly around these notions of transdisciplinarity and sort of working with the communities as part of the community-driven innovation that are really quite central to your work. So I'm very excited about our today's conversation. Would you like to just kind of briefly introduce yourself and just tell us a little bit about yourself and your work?
Yeah, thanks, Joran. A pleasure to be here. I'm based in Toronto, have for a number of years. I'm originally from the UK, and this work sort of came out of a fusion of a lot of things in life, but particularly doing some multi-arts events, which then transitioned to starting a project in South Africa, in the communities in a rural area, really looking at creating a sort of community embedded team of artist facilitators to explore and help to raise awareness and capacities around behaviour change for HIV and healthy choices in that area. And in looking at that, that was working with Sazizi Educational Trust, which has kind of evolved into this multi-service agency, of which there are a number in different places in these lowly resourced regions of rural South Africa and other parts of Africa. And that multi sort of sector, multi-service integration and the range of places that services need to be delivered to is a big factor in what I was seeing going on. And this links to transdisciplinarity, because transdisciplinarity is often more siloed in these more highly resourced, more specialized, certainly in the last 50, 100 years, as things have started to sort of break out and become their own fields, so to speak. So how do we make sense of what it means to have these times of fields? So there's an awful lot of stuff out there around what it means to be understanding, to be a practitioner, to be connecting. And within that work, that's where this community-driven innovation sort of comes along, is where is the inhabiting of the local landscape or any landscape centrally placed. So as opposed to thinking there's this institutional role or this organizational role, it's like there's people inhabiting some sort of dynamic where they're kind of inferring from where they are what's elsewhere. And the community-driven innovation is trying to be positioned as this is actually needed because they're inhabiting spaces which no amount of empathy, no amount of reconfiguring research is ever going to get to that contextual complexity of what's going on in the timescales when it needs to be utilized, so that we can make change. So this sort of ties into a lot of that work with evaluative processes that talk about this. So I'm going to sort of move on and talk to some of these ideas so that come up. So, you know, I'm going to talk a bit here about something kind of unusual. So how could metaphorical and creative spatial modeling be used in practice? So I'm saying modeling, the dynamics of how things can be modeled with people or with entities. So a lot of this stuff's done by biologists with their agent-based approaches. So and I've started to see synergies now, because it was a little bit of a lonely journey at one point as I was trying to really go down some of this route, sort of adapting work from the sort of theatre for transformation kind of, or theatre for development work. And the question there also comes up, and I think this is related to this whole creativity and Innovation sort of week, how might this transform social change and organizational change practices? How can we bring this in? When is it appropriate? When is it going to have the most leverage? When is it worth the time and effort? So these are questions I'm very open to hearing other people's perspectives on, as well as my own sort of thoughts. So as again, I developed Aiding Dramatic Change in Development, a non-profit, to sort of actually at the time really to facilitate the work in South Africa that was then happening, and which then sort of developed into different types of work. And also something called infusion space modeling, which is like trying to understand how this really hyper-local work and the strategic conversations could be actually used and to meaningfully engage higher levels of policy making, rather than sort of saying, okay, this is a really good empowering experience, now let's take a representative and put them in these other spaces and say, well, let's keep this coherence at the local level. So how can the modeling of their dynamics still be done, and how can the dynamics of these other spaces be done? So so these approaches seek to empower sort of a middle ground. They're often called meso level work. So a lot of this sort of finds a bit of jiving with nursing practices as well, actually, and particularly for behavioural and social development work. And I'm looking at embracing the realities, as much as whatever realities means. That's a whole interesting question of this, of what we call complex immersive experiences. So not the moments where we sat and meditated and thought and reflected on what we kind of remember being, or what we kind of see things as in this low action, highly sort of presence in state, which is valuable. But how can we get the realities of these, the most complex immersive experiences at different scales? Because that's often where some key interactions happen, and where it's least available to us as a practitioner, but often where key principles could be derived, which may be the difference that makes the difference, as they say. So so scaling is a big factor here, and scaling can be looked at quite a lot differently when you start to get into the actual scaling from within, and scaling temporally, the scales of the rate at which change is happening or things are happening. So first on the left here, we've got scaling deep. So they talk about scaling deep. So this is kind of thought about. So this is actually adapting the work from South Africa back to a Canadian context here on the left, and the across-gen, connecting across age and culture, which is kind of like a foundational sort of low risk entry point that we're using at the moment to sort of start building capacity with community, based on having done this work. So co-creating community relationships, what's going on there? How can that in itself be part of creating change? Again, that's a nebulous thing that can't be held and then retransmitted from a university. It needs to be in real time to some extent. In the middle, we've got this sort of scaling out. So how can the methods themselves be adapted and evolved? And this actually is where the work was then basically reimagined for a community who are non-verbal. So this is a community that use alternative communications. So we used a lot of the fabrics that we've been using. I'm going to show those soon from some of our work in Africa, and this work called we're connecting across age and culture with adult newcomers or with the communities in South Africa, to communities who were not able to articulate verbally. So we started to use that as a way to do sense breaking what we thought was possible, because a lot of limiting beliefs are there, and then seeing, well, when we start to think about how we then find the sense in all of that, well, what are we able to start to pull together? And then the last one is scaling up, which is more of the earlier work when we took some of this work where with particularly with the youth, and then did it with the parents of the youth, is when we start to look at this scaling up is really scaling it up to another level. So but you know, often that becomes a process of taking an alive, dynamical, interactive living process and codifying it into something which is dead, it doesn't run away, it's not meant to run away, and then trying to unpack it again to some other level and wondering why that maybe doesn't easily work, right? So, at the end of the day, to try and get that, there's some sort of, what sort of higher level trust can be evolved through different intermediate levels of decision support, and how can these processes help with that? So this is some of the ways that scaling can kind of tie into that. And then this is
And,
sort of, yeah, go for it.
and sorry, Stephen, if we could just go back to your previous slide, because I just want
Yeah.
to make one brief comment. This is just so extraordinary because for all of us that are, working with innovation or are trained as ethnographers or facilitators, working with creativity, we have come across, this notion of sense making because it's really central to design. So as designers or facilitators, we're very intimately working with this. And, whether we're approaching that concept from a kind of a scholastic perspective, from something like the work of Brenda Durden or others, sense making has a very rich history and tradition, and how you are exploring this and expanding this, going much more deeply and situating it in a community practice through these processes of sense finding and sense breaking, really challenging our notions around what's possible to do with the sensory experience, and challenging these beliefs, and through scale and deep actually creating a kind of a foundation of community to deal with that. That's really quite fascinating because I find that, again, as we all are, and I feel as if I wonder whether you're kind of inviting us to consider other essential dimensions of that as well.
Yeah, that's actually a really, really good question and a good point, because sense making is being talked about a lot, as you know, the work of David Snowden, Cynthia Kurtz as well, and others is, and it sort of comes out of ecological psychology and some of the more embodied ideas, which were sort of coming along and seemed a little bit to the side. And just like there was some of the work elsewhere with robotics was actually a little bit to the side. And what's really interesting is now there's this idea in really fundamentally cognition, or what does it mean to act and perceive in the world, is seen often as a sense making process. And so I've been looking at that, and I think that's why I put sense making here, because in some ways there's different ways of thinking about sense making, but it's something that becomes apparent when the practices which can normally be undertaken start to break down, right? The cup breaks. So sense making is I now need to find a way to hold water. Whereas before I just picked up a cup and drank. The sense making was sort of avoided. There wasn't a gap to bridge, right? It was all seamlessly into my daily practice. And this is where this becomes interesting, is because I was looking a lot at sense making, and it's still quite making, it's still quite doing, it's still quite thing based, right? You're making stuff. And what I've been really looking at then is, okay, well, when we're looking at some of this spatial work, is part of that work is in the process is actually breaking what is seen as being normal. It's not necessarily breaking it only by taking away the affordance. What you can also do is you can just put in more parameters than we normally do when we start to analyze. Case in point, the connecting across age and culture. It started off as an intergenerational project. Plenty, you can do the research, then you get the papers, and you did the proposal, and then we had the problems with parents and children. But then some of the participants said, "Well, I want to talk to the local people, some of the newcomers." It's like, well, that's a cultural issue, and they're not on the immigration forms for the multicultural centres because they don't think about that as being there. But actually, this was a massive resource, opportunity, and place for happening. The fact that it's not on the forms isn't the reason it shouldn't happen, right? But it ends up being the reason it doesn't happen in many cases, or it didn't happen. We have seen a shift now since when this happened, because that was about 10 years ago. But this idea then is like, by asking people to think about both culture and age when looking at a situation, you don't just break it and fit it to a model. And I'm going to come back to this. You can't say, okay, here it is, and be like, yeah, well, I mean, that's clearly an intergenerational problem between the parent and the child, and the child knows more language than the parent, and I've got a model for that, or I've got a model for this. But when you try and have an intergenerational and an intercultural, people actually, and it's quite nice. And in the spatial activity, that's really helpful, because they can then go for another way of knowing, which is affectively feeling where they know something about the question or the theme or the space. Where, not what, but where. What can come later? So that process of seeking, so that's partly where the sense finding comes in, and it's the sense finding, sense breaking. It's a little bit more complex than shown here, but because and there may be some more sense making going on at times as well. But there's the key part, which I'm going to sort of mention in some of these spatial activities, is there's a period of time. It's like this magic period of flow, but also discombobulation at times, to get an audience into this space without them being confused, but just disorientated, but having ways to find orientation. So this process is what starts to really bring in the embodiedness, right? Because affect and the work that I'm part of, something called the Active Inference Lab, and the Active Inference Lab is dealing with the work of Carl Friston and the way that action and perception are dynamically linked. And I'm going to bring a little bit up later, but it underpins, and it finally gave some sort of foundational principles for why this works. Why, in each of these cases, finding how it is from within, or giving people that agency to be the agent within, knowing that if there's a problem understanding it from the outside, that's my problem. It's not their problem communicating. It will be my problem, because I will not know. I will not know what it's like to be using an AAC device all the time and having not been able to articulate in the way I am. That is a reality. There's the deep intercultural interdynamics of newcomers who are not speaking English, or in a rural area of South Africa, particularly marginalized people who are very different. I can't take my reality and do a what we call mentalize. I can't mentalize easily based on what I am to them. I need to find these ways to give ownership to them, give ownership to the modeling of that, and then trust that we can do something with it. And that's where it starts to get kind of interesting, because that led to a whole load of integrations of methods which seems kind of separate, but are starting to have a coherence. So this is really one of the sort of an example of a place-based. This is one of the adaptations of the social drama topography workshop, originally designed for youth, looking at the landscape of the school and peer influence. This was then adapted for townships, and then adapted for an Oxfam Australia funded project, Tulawazi Uzufakela, which is another part of the northern KwaZulu Natal in South Africa, was going out and doing this social drama topography workshop, where it's about getting a sense of what it's like as a participant in a group. It's 20 more people, so you're dispersed. So you're not this, again, it dissolves this ability to say this is what this is happening here, because there's too many dynamics going on. The way to integrate that is being someone who knows that geography in real life, being in the map, which is the size of the room, eventually was made of fabric, to understand it. So this is actually the team going to ask another community to join in these workshops. They actually had to take their trousers and that, put it in a bucket, so they could walk across the salt lake, because their people lived on an island surrounded by salt water, so they couldn't drink that water. So it's a water and sanitation health project. So again, it ended up that in that case there, with all that complexity, the villagers actually, because they normally ask them if they want to partake first and they come back a week later, they actually decided not to do it, that particular group. So but they were doing other catchment areas as well, where people were going to fresh water, but there'd be alligators there. People going through snakes, carrying water on their head. So this idea of something that's highly contextual, highly dynamic, started to raise all these questions, right? How can what it means? And at first, I was really trying to understand, what does it mean to be looking at people in this map? I was trying to understand what is being represented here. How can I represent this map better? But what I changed, and this is the big mind shift that's now, well, it's about what is the experience of being in the map, and how does that experience correlate with the kind of experience of the world? Because one of the big things about being in a map as opposed to looking at a map is, if I turn around in it and I'm looking this way, or I turn around and look like, well, I've got my back now. It's very, very different. It doesn't look so different if I even move a counter on a board game. But certainly if I have a map, orientation is relatively hard to introduce. So this is one of the key pieces that sort of led to that. And then this is the fabric map that relates to one of the communities doing that. And the pink is the routes to water that people were taking to get to water. So and different people have done different maps around the room, and they were sort of inquiring about that and starting to unpack that. So, what's their shared social geography, but obviously there's many other things going on. And all this was also being done in isiZulu language, facilitated in Zulu. And so also there was not an ability for me to put my prepackaged biases or beliefs there. And it was a good thing in many ways, I think. So I suppose in a way, I think that what I'm really looking at here is a bigger, as things are starting to draw out, to sort of the fundamental principles, is, can we be engaged in a paradigm shift so that we can see what roles there might be to move beyond the dangers this model fit in, this dangers of come in as a client to a therapist and that we fit to that model, or the psychiatrist fits people to their model and prescribes. Can we get inside the dynamics of what's happening? And this is where some of these methodologies that I've been working with then found their way to connect to some other processes which I then found out about, which have been very exciting, particularly the mental space psychology world, which I found out about, which I then also found ties into the clean language world, which is a way to unpack using metaphors and I was trying to do non-directive facilitation, where they have extremely non-directive questions to the point where they're not even contaminating. So those questions are both very useful more broadly in my facilitation now, but also really speaks to this idea of helping the client do self-modeling of the dynamics of their experience. And this ties to this broader work of active influence, which is also a non-linear dynamical modeling approach, which comes from the world of actually computational neuroscience, which is a very fast-growing world. And the more and more they started working with the brain and started to think, well, what's the brain trying to do if it's maybe predicting the world outside? And having started from an incredibly brain-based, nerve-based starting point, I'd say this is turned around and say, well, if the brain is trying to control action and interaction and predict what's out there, then the body needs to be involved. And if the body's involved, it's where's the body involved? And basically, through a path which was not of any design, but by literally an unfolding, they realized that the brain-body environment starts to become really important. And then what's the parameters around that? And of course, what's hard to do in these computational models is to get anywhere near the level of complexity. So what I'm seeing as a route with this type of work, which was coming from another approach, is that rather than having these very, very low dimensional models, which they'll be using and getting very, very useful insights around autism, schizophrenia, many different things, and some real insights into the way dynamics shift, the way beliefs get updated and all this thing, is how can this work give a sense of how does our social topographies evolve? How do but we're not necessarily, and using a similar, very first principled parameters. In their case, they sometimes call them hyperparameters, or they call them different belief updating mechanisms. But in our case, it's like ways that the community can, or whoever's participating, starts to engage, often with an initial point of sense breaking, so that their top-down didactic ways of processing are suspended for a period, and they're just starting to act and sense to find what might be there and seeing what patterns might be there, in a similar way that happens in a lot of these other processes like clean language, which I can even describe. So this my question might be to people is, so we've got these non-linear modeling approaches that are starting to grow huge, and are congruent with a lot of this chat GPT approach of being predictive, but goes a whole way further than that, because it's actually based on biophysics and biology. Can these spatially modeling help us with these previously intractable complex dynamics in real social and organizational change places? And that's where either this work in the communities which I'm sharing, or other work which I'm called infusion modeling, which is more an organizational, a multi-level, multi-scale process, really start to be made tractable. And I think the answer is yes, but it requires a transdisciplinary way of working, because there's one thing doing it, but there's another thing making it useful. How can it be utilized? It needs to travel, information needs to go somewhere often, or it needs to find a way to go somewhere to really have that big benefit. Because you may get away with the simple model fitting can work if you've just got people all in the same box and they all sort of understand roughly the rules of the game because they've been trained to. But when you've got this uncertainty in the complexity, maybe uncertainty is a bigger factor than complexity in itself, which is key. So, and current practice in community psychology and a number of theories there are to try and bridge different concepts. So I'm going to go through a little bit of this, but this all ties into sense. You could say sense making or participatory sense making, which is what they use in the terms for process for a lot of the embodied cognition work. Participation comes in because the brain is as an active participant in a process. It's not the computer per se, right? It's controlling or trying to get some sort of grip. It never gets a full grip. Everything's something, which is partly why humans have done so well by using and working with others socially, because that's how we help get all these integrated grips to sort of fit some sort of knowing at sort of a higher level of precision. It looks like we've got these really clever brains, and we do, but it's not necessarily isn't necessarily what sets us apart. The ability to think what I think you think, and what might be valuable and meaningful in all of this in relation to all of that, gives us, and that's where we go a little bit out of kilter when we get deprived of that with COVID and stuff, because we don't have that way to bring us back. So this is a common one here, which is the Brofana sort of ecological model. It's useful. It shows these different levels of the system, from an individual through to the sort of family, to the sort of family bridging to the kind of broader ecosystems. But this is still looking at this individual as an outside perspective on, because the individual here is artificially kind of ascribed these identity ideas, these data points, but that's not what it's like to be inside there. So one of the things we're really looking at, and I'll be interested in what your thoughts are about this question about trying to solve problems, blind spots. How can we solve problems, knowledge gaps, implementation blind spots, and find meaningful change? Get these new value propositions for this kind of work. I'd be curious about that, especially for people who maybe are working more across different types of sectors, because I think this work's got the ability to make a huge impact in the world, just like clean language has started to do, actually, and the work with modeling of metaphors is starting to do. But I think this is another part of that. So I don't know what your thoughts on that, Joran. I'm going to keep clicking
Yeah.
through it, but you know.
Yeah, I'll just briefly add to that, as a yes and I completely agree. I mean, I think as innovators and creatives and facilitators, we're increasingly, seeing calls for, trans-disciplinarity and which seems necessary given the exigent challenges that the world is facing at the moment, from the climate crisis to migrations to the changing nature of work to the healthcare crises that we were just experiencing. And increasingly, it seems that, we can benefit from working together. And when we attempt to do that, as innovators or uh, change agents, we start discovering that there are, as you say, a number of gaps, and it becomes a kind of a twofold challenge to first of all understand the nature of the gaps. How might we understand the nature of these gaps, and then in what way might we actually bridge these gaps into some kind of a coherence, and hopefully without uh, as you say, kind of polluting it with their own sort of conceptions that might or might not be appropriate for the situation. And what I think myself and so many others appreciate about your work is that we see an invitation in your work to kind of go much more deeply into deeper dynamics to both understand these gaps and how we might bridge them. And earlier you mentioned the notion of trust building, which seems to be really kind of an emergent property in your work that otherwise is rather elusive. So it seems that you're kind of connecting things and inviting us to apply these methods really in novel ways so that we can enable this working together in a much more kind of emergent way.
Brilliant. Yeah, I think that's a really good point. The nature of the gaps. I mean, and that actually is like, what does that mean to have the gap? When we think about gap, obviously a physical spatial gap, right? But then there could be a trust gap. That's an interesting thing. Trust is is it a spatial property or not? It's interesting. It's a quality, and there could be a gap between what's needed to enable something to go forward, right? Or in the way that it could certainly change the quality of how things change. And I think one of the big things with that as well is, and this is what's been really, and this slide sort of speaks to that, is gaps are also, or the are in the gaps between what's available for us to understand. So there's this gaps between different people who end up being maybe in the same space or communicating. There's a gap between communicating, but there's a gap between us communicating and the physical spaces we're communicating about. There's they talk about things separated by time and space, right? So there's a temporal space between us and the event. There's also the temporal space within the event. So here, this is one of the Imagining Possibilities project with the complex disability here. Well, what's going on for people as they try to engage the participants when we do a big public performance, actually, where we use fabric plates and fabric food. So this is a sense breaking. People come in and they're asked to the community members with the complex disability are the ones who know the rules of the game. And the audience are coming and they have to be the ones who have to take the risk to go to the edge of what they think is possible. And they've been served fabric food, which they can't eat, but neither can the participants because they often can't eat solid food. So what does that mean? They're not told that's going to be there. They're just told to go and find the food that might take them to the edge of knowing and to move beyond that. And they're having to find what that means, but they're also having to contend with a very different rebalancing of the dynamic between a participant as someone with a complex disability who's a client and needs being met, and the dynamics of something bigger, something else that's going on here where that's been flipped and suddenly they're the ones running the event. But anyway, the key piece there is this availability of knowing in that moment. There's a whole load of dynamics going on. So there's a gap between, this is one of the things, is there's a gap between what's going on at this kind of like the rate at which we can sort of understand things happening, how much we can participate in the dynamics, in real time. But underneath that, as well as there's almost like a timelessness quality, and you get this with metaphors. So if you ask someone, as well as the story of what happened, which happens at a certain time scale, and I've got here, what's the attention in the moment? What's the awareness of the architecture of the event, which maybe we can have our stories around? What was the architecture and the places that it was in? And we can have our narratives around all of that. But they start to become more or less available. But when we're looking at what is happening, what we're doing, and what's available to us, what's that like to be there in that experience is one thing. That's not necessarily the same as the story of it, what happened. Then there's many things happening. And as you say, what's that like, a particular event, it often becomes kind of a timeless sort of space of like relating to that. And that's when this work becomes very much about the work with adjacent possibilities, which we often hear about. And in clean language, it's often the adjacent possibilities. We're working with the symbols that are brought up in the metaphor work. There's some other approaches which literally you are in the space and what's the actual affordances, the opportunities for action as a physical being there, either in your virtual world or your, how shall I put it, in your metaphorical world, which is still embodied. Because we talk about things being in our head, but whenever you listen to these metaphors, these metals are always somewhere in or around us. They're never in our head. So it's all going on in my head. Well, it's never in my head when you actually look at where it is. And whereabouts is pain? Well, pain is some here. Or whereabouts is making things change? Or change is maybe over here. And these things have a time, a place, a space, and they relate. So you've got this kind of embodiedness in the middle. And that's where a lot of this work with metaphor really works well. And then what then we have is we have these kind of, above this, we have this kind of visioning. We tend to, and we focus a lot on this, which is literally perspective taking. We look down on, can you see that okay? Does that work? It's a bit small. You can see, I can make it bigger. Should I make that a bit bigger?
Yeah, maybe just for our viewers, if you want, maybe you could just have the we could change to the speaker view just to be able to see you a
Yeah.
little
I
bit
got to,
better.
yeah, okay, let me do that.
I think you would probably have to stop the
Just,
presentation. We could take a look at you and then
oh
come
yeah,
back.
stop the sharing. Okay, got you. Oh yeah, okay. So you've got the nature of these gaps and the trust gaps. Okay, as was one of the things. But we have this idea that we're in our place, and we often think about things going up again in our model. But if we're actually embodying and we start to look at how we're dynamically in the space, well, as an agent, I don't think like a pyramid. Okay. Most of my actions don't happen with my feet. Most of my actions happen with my hands. Okay. And we're working and interacting with the world. I can move myself around that landscape with my feet, but I'm actually interacting. A lot of my grip, a lot of my chance to interact is often around this middle level. And we often have this idea of, we look at these slower dynamics by bringing in this vision. And we kind of think that we have a vision in our head. Well, if we dispense with the idea of vision in our head and we're just participating in getting a grip on what's out there, then our vision is, in a way, whatever we put into our environment, our diagrams, our objects, that we vision and we look down on. Probably the reason why we're so into board games as a species, right? We're working and we're looking at and taking a perspective on something. So if we literally take a lot of things that we would gloss over as things as just figures of speech or idioms and say, no, if I say I'm feeling just stuck in a hole or trapped in a rut, as opposed to sliding out of control, well, that is a very different structure for being in the world, and that information is encoded differently. It's not just a problem and a problem, which, you know, oh, we all agree there's a problem, we got consensus. Well, if I'm stuck in a rut or I'm sliding and I can't stop myself, practicalities are quite different, right? And those hidden dynamics become important because no one can know that unless the person from within starts to reveal some of those dynamics. You can't use your PhDs to get that from some model that has been pre-created, no matter how good that model is. And this is that paradigm shift. And underneath that, we also then have these these timeless dynamics. The ground we think is there forever, but actually, if we're kind of looking at the dynamics of our embodiment, or the dynamics of us being an alive species, there's an awful lot of the dynamics are way below, are way faster. Our perceptual processes, what's coming in, and the dynamics are at a faster rate than what I'm able to talk to you about. I can sort of talk to you at a tenth of a second upwards, up to like being able to be aware of what's going on every few minutes, right? Well, there's stuff going on all the time that we don't, and we certainly don't put them in our stories because it's efficient not to. But actually, sometimes it makes a big difference at key moments when key choices are made that maybe is what makes someone enable a project to really work and engage people. It's something about that dynamic in the space which gets revealed. So in these spatial activities, it gives a way to break out of the vision being a board game, brings it back into this metaphor, and starts to literally, you can step into it and out of it and with it and out of it and look at the qualities and compare and see what's adjacent. But also then with some of these other spatial activities and the tools, starts to get at some other dynamics which are hidden, are actually only available because we move around a calibrated space which we feel, we don't actually know why we're placing ourselves. We just feel this is how our intention and attention, we call them like regimes of attention, how that is. And what's quite interesting is that work was always based on using affective qualities and effective knowing. And actually that same thing, as they went through and they started going through all the different layers to go more and more complex in the computational modeling for active inference, they found that to get the overall arching integrating process, they needed something like affect, something to give you a feel when it's right. So the highest level thinking in some ways is being always calibrated by a feeling. So the mathematician Einstein is feeling when he's got the answer. So there's a quality of that, which is what's the difference between being alive and being a machine, right? But we can start to step into that because it's alive in a different way all the time. It's continually fluxing and changing and dissipating and all these qualities that are going on. So that is one of the big parts of this. So I'm going to just go back to the slide. So again, this is moving from the brain as a computer processing representations to the brain as part of a non-linear dynamical brain body environment prediction system. Actually, it's called, it can be even thought of in terms of like a control process at a very, very foundational level. But just this idea is quite a foundational change. A lot of things become different once we start to do that. A lot of things become inconvenient because it's a lot easier to measure the brain. It's not easy to measure the body. It's sort of not too bad to measure the brain and the body, but you bring three bodies together, you can kind of start to overload any sort of system. However, we can come back at it the other way using these spatial approaches. We can use people's ability to know, how we position, orientate, and contextualize. That can be another way of knowing what psychological perspective might mean. And that is a key thing. So again, just talking about speed, there's a lot of things that are going on which are slower than we're aware. So one of the things is when your feet are outside the covers in a bed, you don't realize that your feet are getting cold until later. You are not, it's too small a process for you to be aware. And that happens with sunburn as well. We are at the end of the day attuned to a certain scale that works with who we are in our body, and that's how we know. And that integration is really important because it's particularly the things which can't be done or need that knowing, to be present, that's important. ChatGPT has shown that actually language, while we think language is alive, it is alive because we're actually acting and interacting through our voice box to spatially work with words in space. Once they have meaning and what the word means and it's put in the dictionary, it's dead. It can be put in a file and it can be picked up 200 years later. It won't be reimagined quite the same way, but and that's partly because we've got something literally, completely literally, and not in a way which is trying to be disparaging. We are literally talking about things being dead and in the environment, and the process and even the meaning at some level is held as a social awareness, but the meaningful action of bringing that back is about acting and interacting and predicting what that's about. What does it mean to read Shakespeare in a context, with an audience, without an audience, at home? So these are all some of the things that come into that. And this sort of brings in some other field work of how embodiment happens. So there's a whole load of work which goes into the world of infusion space, deals with some of this, to try and underpin that. So when it comes to what the facilitator or the evaluator or the participants are working with, they don't need to necessarily know any of this, but there is a practice to try and give some sort of foundational principles to help actually simplify and hone in and find the essential guiding principles of what is working and why, and also then what can be practically communicated as a little process within which the actual participants work with. In the connecting across age and culture, that process is about establishing a relational understanding only, which can be done with a mapping process, and it can work when you have people who only speak Farsi, only speak Spanish, only speak Mandarin in the same space. They can all be working together at that level and can communicate using sculpted images, then bring it back into a relational map. And once we have that, we bring in the understanding, the mutual understanding between the relational actors and the dynamics within that of where the trust is and what kinds of trust there are. And by doing that, we can get into really complex spaces, but still communicate because we've broken down the modeling parameters that we're going to work with, so that as it comes from each person, it's being processed in a way where it can be sense finding can happen. Sense breaking needed to happen sometimes, and normally, particularly if you ever work with university professors, normally the sense breaking is just needed to allow the sense finding to be given time and space to just be, because we don't do that all the time, and it's quite right that we don't. And it's actually looks that can be detrimental. That may be where some of the over compensation of ADHD and autistic tendencies, they will pick up on an awful lot of information and nuances which would be missed by the average person, but it also becomes overloading. So we're trying to find the times which creates this space to break down these top-down models. And this is what I would call an enactive ecological spatial embodiment approach. So, and, you know, looking at different ways of looking at, again, this vision, this action, and this effectively situated knowing, and connecting this with systemic perspectives and ways of embodied knowing. Basically, everything's embodied at some level, at all levels in a way. The question then is how much of that is being mostly mediated through dead things that we work with in our environment, and which things are about being in the moment where it's only transiently present. When is it performative, or when is it maybe more instrumentalized? So, and this then ties into and scales up to living in land-based processes, which scales deep and can dynamically work with an organizational taskscape, which is your community organization, and how that then links to and avoids some of the top-down models which these official institutional bodies create, be that universities, be that the UN, right? They're there to create models which can roll out. What I'd say to the UN is, when can we find ways to have models to enable the modeling from different cycles, different speeds of knowing, to be informed at appropriate places, so that you get this contextuality? Because that trap of taking something from the local level and researching it and then 5 years later rolling out reports and disseminating can never be overcome unless you have more of this dynamic processing. So I'm going to pass that back to you, Joran, because I know time's ticking by, and let's see what sort of things we might want to take from this. But this slide is sort of just bringing us into another level of the same sort of grounded, another scale of working. Okay, so now instead of it being me in my place and space where I've got where I am, what I'm doing, what I'm thinking and visioning, this is kind of encoded into where people are living, where organizations have taskscapes, where regulatory institutions are being bodies that sort of manage or
It's just incredible. It's just incredible. I realize, Stephen, that you are just in a sense kind of covering just the outer layer of your work, and that we could be really moving into like a whole day symposium on this. And I hope we do at some point, because this seems so exciting and vibrant. Because as you say, where we take this work is so interesting, because I mean, as innovators, as creatives, as change makers, I mean, we're increasingly asked to facilitate and intermediate spaces that are profoundly complex. And again, whether that's due to the climate crisis or changing natures of work, you mentioned ChatGPT, there are a lot of upcoming changes that are happening to our various communities. And a fundamental aspect of that is really engaging effectively, hopefully, with these communities, and uh, engendering some kind of positive change and positive impact. And often we're finding that even just the notion of trust building and attempting to bring all of the sort of perspectives in the room is actually quite challenging. And having this wonderful opportunity to look at your process as an invitation to work with things in a much more embodied way and much more dynamically, I think opens up all kinds of interesting perspectives for us as facilitators and innovators and creatives and change makers, that I think I get a sense is just starting the conversation, a very important conversation that we're very much looking forward to following up on.
Perfect. Yeah, no, thank you. And I suppose what I could do is, if I just bring this right back to just sort of the very early bit, to sort of give it a bit of maybe contained scope. How could creative, metaphorical and creative spatial modeling, and hopefully the idea of modeling and the be used in practice? Where would it have its most traction? How might this transform social change and organizational change practices? Be it through this idea of an infusion lab, which is why I've been looking at that, and we've been using it with different organizations. But because we've been so looking at a very tight set of processes, hasn't had a chance to scale that much, right? But that would be, how does that relate to configuring spaces, inhabiting places, and trans-disciplinarity can meaningfully engage with community-driven innovation? So, I'd be really interested to see where that might go. And, thanks for this opportunity. It's been really cool.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Stephen. We'll make certain to be forwarding any questions and any comments on our World Creativity and Innovation Week Canada YouTube channel to you, because I'm certain there will be a lot of interesting questions and engagement. And indeed, on behalf of the World Creativity and Innovation Week and Day, as part of the United Nations International Day of Observance, we'd love to thank you profusely for dedicating the time out of your busy calendar and sharing this with us. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you. Take care.